I'm Edward Trapunski, and as always, I'm privileged and honored to be the chair of the jury for the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards. I'm welcoming you to the 7th successful year for the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards. This is the second year that our award celebration is online, and we're glad you found a way to celebrate with us and with the authors whose books we are honoring today. I know you would all like to meet the authors in person and buy their books and chat with them and get their books autographed. Maybe next year, if everybody does as they should and gets vaccinated, so we have no more COVID. I hope you enjoy our Zoom presentation. If you stick around afterwards, you can ask questions of the authors. If you click on the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, I will compile the questions on your behalf and the authors will answer them. If you're watching on YouTube, we'll post the event and you could enjoy it again and again and again. The Canadian Jewish Literary Awards is a celebration. It celebrates and recognizes and rewards the finest Canadian Jewish writing on subjects with Jewish themes or with significant, authentic Jewish content by Canadian authors or permanent residents of Canada. The awards grow in stature every year and has become a cornerstone in the Canadian Jewish community's cultural calendar. Culture is a major measure of the vibrancy of Jewish life in Canada. The Canadian Jewish Literary Award contributes to that health and to the health of the communal culture by promoting not just Jewish writers and editors, but Jewish ideas, creativity, and scholarship. Honoring the best Jewish books of the year in the various genres allow us to better understand ourselves and our collective past and our shared present and the uncertain world of our future. The Canadian Jewish Literary Awards is honoring 6 outstanding books for 2021, and they are truly outstanding. You will meet Sigal Samuel, the author of Oz Not and Her Dove for children's and youth literature. For fiction, Gary Barwin for his book, Nothing the Same, Everything Haunted. Poet Lisa Richter is honored for Bone and Nautilus. Menachem Kaiser for his memoir, Plunder. Judy Batalion for The Light of Days in the Holocaust category. And in the scholarship category, Rebecca Clifford for Survivors, Children's Lives After the Holocaust. The depth and the breadth of our books shows the vibrancy of our culture and the appeal of Jewish themes for fiction and nonfiction writers. Just to show how widespread the influence of Canadians writing about Jewish themes is, we are honoring writers today from Wales, Brooklyn, Washington, Hamilton, and Toronto. While the cash value of the prizes we are giving out this afternoon is significant for the writers, it's the reputation and standing of this jury that underscores its importance. The award winners are going to do most of the talking and reading this afternoon, and the member of the juries will be doing the introductions. I would like to introduce the distinguished jury. Pierre Anctil, Professor of History at the University of Ottawa, where he specializes in the Montreal Jewish community. Rona Ratto is an award-winning author of 15 children's books and children's and youth books. Miriam Borden is a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and she's an oral history fellow at the Yiddish Book Center. Rita Davies is the chair of the Ontario Arts Council. Alain Goldschlager is the former director of the Holocaust Literature Research Institute and professor of French at Western University. Alain is away right now in Belgium working on his next literary project. Adam Saul teaches at Victoria College, University of Toronto. He's a poet, and his book of poems, Broken Dawn Blessings, is just published. Once again, the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University is our main sponsor. The center has played a vital role in helping to present the Canadian Jewish Literary Award. I'd like to recognize the valuable contribution of coordinator Julie Feinberg. And I'd like to welcome David Kaufman, the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry and the associate head of the Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University. David?
Thank you very much, Edward. I would just like to offer a word of thanks on behalf of the Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies, and really our sincere congratulations to all the award-winning authors. Mazel tov to all of you. Your books are very exciting, and we're really pleased to be part of the project. Something from Edmond Jabez, the great post-war French Jewish writer, comes to mind in his book, the famous book, The Book of Questions, where he speaks in his oddly poetic and Talmudic voice about the virtues of being in the book. And to write a book, as I know and many people do on this call, is an extraordinarily large endeavor, and it connects you better to life and life back to you. So with this very Jewish wish to be in the book, I offer extra congratulations to the award winners and say that you are indeed in the book and of the book by winning these prizes. I'd also just like to mention that we have some other co-sponsors. We are one proud leader in the pack, but this event is a rare one that celebrates Jewish letters across Canada, and it's rare in the sense that it combines efforts and sources of support from a number of universities across Canada, including Carleton, the University of Ottawa, Concordia, McGill, University of Toronto, and Western, as well as the support of the United Jewish Appeals Committee on Yiddish and the national body, the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. So on behalf of all of these supporting institutions, once again, congratulations. And I will pass the mic back to you, Edward.
Thank you very much. And I also want to add a shout out to my friend, David Groskin, who maintains our website and does so much to help me and Julie to make this a success. And I want to acknowledge our donors, our benefactors, our supporters, and the many members of the community who've helped us throughout the years. Through the generosity of our patrons, we've raised the funds to sustain the award program. And although these are challenging times, we plan to grow even stronger. So we'd like you to partner with us. Building a more robust donor base would allow us to increase the value of the prizes to winners, to attract more entries, to welcome larger audience, and in turn, to do more to promote Jewish culture in Canada. Click on the How to Donate button on our website, and you'll be able to help us. And now I want to present our first award. I'd like to give it over to Rona Arata.
Hello, I'm Rona Arado, and it's my pleasure to present the award for children and youth to Sigal Samuel for Osnet and Her Dove. Sigal is an award-winning author and journalist. Her children's book, Osnet and Her Dove, tells the true story of the world's first female rabbi. Her debut novel, The Mystics of Miles End, tells the story of a dysfunctional family dealing with mysticism, madness, and mathematics in Montreal. It won the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Fiction in 2016. So Sigal is a returning award winner. Currently, she is a senior reporter at Vox. She previously worked as the religion editor at The Atlantic, opinion editor at The Forward, and associate editor at The Daily Beast. Sigal hails from an Iraqi Jewish family in Montreal. Osnet and Her Dove is a mesmerizing portrait of a remarkable woman. This true story is told in lyrical language with lush illustrations that evoke a spiritual and mystical mood. The backgrounds, white stars give a feeling of illuminated mystery, while interior scenes convey domestic activity, and Torah study is drawn in vibrant colors, reminiscent of medieval illuminated manuscripts. And so now I'd like to introduce Sigal, and she is going to introduce us to her absolutely wonderful book, Mazel Tov, Sigal.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I want to say thank you to the judges, to the organizers of this event, and to all the readers and book lovers here. And I want to start by telling you a little secret. When I was younger, I had a dream of becoming a rabbi, but I didn't tell anybody because I was growing up Orthodox. I almost never saw a Jewish leader who was a woman. And even when I did, she never really looked like me or my family. My family comes from Baghdad in Iraq. And I thought that for a girl like me to become a rabbi was just impossible. So it really came as a revelation to me the day that I learned about a Kurdish girl named Osnat Barzani. She was born in 1590 in Mosul, just a couple hours from my family's hometown. And she became the world's first female rabbi in the 1600s. She was a brilliant scholar and poet and teacher, and she even became the leader of the Mosul yeshiva. She also had a reputation for performing miracles, from healing her pet dove to saving a congregation from a giant fire. I was really shocked by Osnat's story because I had always thought that the first female rabbi emerged way, way later in the 1900s. And I realized nobody knows Osnat's story because there are 0 books written about her. So I scoured the historical records. I found letters that male rabbis wrote to Osnat, calling her my mother, my rabbi. And I read legends about Osnat, which Kurdish women have kept for centuries in amulets, like this one that I want to show you. I got this one from my own family. And speaking of family, Osnat probably couldn't have achieved what she did without the support of her father, Rabbi Samuel Barzani, who taught her Torah, Talmud, Midrash, and Kabbalah, which was beyond unconventional, almost impossible to imagine at that time. Similarly, I would not be where I am today without the support of my father, who taught me Torah, Talmud, Midrash, and Kabbalah. He instilled in me a love of Jewish texts and books in general in extracurricular lessons that took place around our dining room table. He tirelessly fed my passion for reading and writing, just like Osnat's dad did for her. In fact, these illustrations of them by my incredible illustrator, Vali Mincy, could easily be illustrations of my dad and me when I was a kid. So that's part of why Osnat's story resonated with me and why I wanted to write this book. So I would just like to dedicate this Canadian Jewish Literary Award to my dad. And to all the parents here listening, I hope you'll take inspiration from this book to feed your children's passions, especially if they point them down unconventional, impossible seeming paths. And most of all, for all the kids who read this book, my hope is that Osnat will serve as proof that they can become leaders too, no matter what they look like or where they come from. And thanks to this award, I am really hopeful that this story will find its way to many more young readers, and I'm especially grateful for that. So thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much for that beautiful presentation. I'm Rita Davies, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce the 2021 winner of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards for Fiction, Gary Barwin, for his genre-defying work of unbounded imagination, Nothing the Same, Everything Haunted, the Ballad of Mottle the Cowboy. This is Gary's second win at the CJLA. In 2017, he picked up the prize for Yiddish for Pirates. Other prizes include the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor. He's been shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and the Governor General's Award for English Language Fiction, and many other awards and prizes, too numerous for me to recount in the short time I have. Gary's creative output defies easy classifying. In addition to fiction, he writes poetry, visual poetry, music, sound works, children's, and YA literature. I run out of fingers on both hands. In conferring the prize to Gary for Nothing the Same, Everything Haunted, the jury noted, this original and moving exploration of genocide and persecution is filled with heartbreak and the enduring quest for hope in the face of horror of the Shoah. The integration of tragedy and humor in the Jewish tradition is masterful. Please join me in welcoming Gary Barwin.
Thank you so much. It's really very moving to receive a Jewish award for a novel about the Holocaust, particularly one that draws deeply on the story and experiences of my family and their history in Lithuania. Literature can offer connection, empathy, understanding, and consolation between those of vastly different experiences. It explains ourselves, but also to others. And my book makes connections between the Shoah and Indigenous genocide. Once, the remarkable Métis writer Cherie Dimelin said to me that we're genocide buddies, Jews and Indigenous people. That's brutally true and important. Since I first encountered them as a teenager, I often think of these lines from Marvin Bell's poem, Gemwood. Now it seems to me the heart must enlarge to hold the losses we have ahead of us. To me, this means that while we must be ready for what the future brings, we must also be ready for the extent of the losses of the past and present as we continue to learn. Like the universe itself, both past and present never stop expanding. That's one function of writing, to expand, but also to encounter that expansion, those stories. So there's an old joke about when Abe finally meets God and tells him a Holocaust joke. God doesn't get it. Well, Abe says, guess you had to be there. Without parsing the theological implication of that joke, I can say that it is the role of writers, particularly, to be there, to act as witnesses to the witnesses, and allow others to be there, both now and in the future. And also to be vigilant about that present and that future, so that no one can say they didn't know or didn't notice about any genocide or persecution. My novel weaves broad research with stories I learned directly from my family, including my grandparents, my parents, my in-laws, our family friend Erwin Karania, and my great uncle Isaac Grajutis, a painter. His painting is just over there, of this picture of Vilnius, a painter who as a child literally walked himself to safety. I'm of course deeply grateful to all of them and to the survivors and researchers for sharing their stories and knowledge. I'd also like to thank my agent, Sean Bradley, and my editor, Ann Collins, and my parents, in-laws, siblings, children, and my wife, Beth, for their continued support, enthusiasm, and curiosity. And of course, I'd like to thank the jury and wise people that they are, and to supporters of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards. As I said, this really means a lot to me. I'd like to end with a story about the great Yiddish poet and resistance fighter, Avram Sutzkever, a story I paraphrase in my novel. He'd found himself having to cross a minefield and having no idea where the mines were, didn't know where to step. He decided, because it was as good an idea as any, to put his faith in literature and walk across the minefield in the rhythm of a poem. Miracle of miracles, he made it safely across the field. In an interview he gave years later, he said, I wish I could remember what that poem was, because it turned out to be a very useful poem. So there's that, putting one's faith in the power of literature to give hope, to guide, to surprise and outwit, and to take you through dangerous places, provide a good story, a good punchline, and sometimes a happy ending. Again, thank you very much. I'm really honored by this award.
Hello, my name is Adam Saul, and I have the great honor to introduce the winner of the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Poetry this year, Lisa Richter, for her collection, Nautilus and Bone. Lisa Richter is a Toronto-based poet, writer, and educator. She's the author of 2 full-length collections, Closer to Where We Began, and this one, Nautilus and Bone, which, in addition to winning our prize, was also the winner of the National Jewish Book Award for Poetry in the United States, and was also longlisted for the Raymond Schuster Award here in Canada. Her poetry and nonfiction has appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, and she teaches community-based creative writing workshops for the Writers Collective of Canada here in Toronto. Lisa Richter's Nautilus and Bone is a poetic tour de force, a reclamation project of Jewish literary history, an act of radical empathy, and a moving exploration of how a wild spirit searches for beauty and love. A reimagining of the unconventional life of the poet Anna Margolin, this collection has all the ambition, romance, and ferocity of its subject. I return to it with pleasure and admiration. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Lisa Richter.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this absolutely incredible honor. I'm thrilled and humbled to be the recipient of this year's Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Poetry, and in such an exceptional company. I'd just like to start by thanking the jury for this honor, my publisher, Frontenac House, the whole team there, with a special thanks to my editor, Micheline Mailer, for her faith in me and her vision in this project, my family for their constant love and support, and Shirley Kumov, the translator of Anna Margolin's single volume of poetry, which you published as Drunk from the Bitter Truth in 2007, without which I wouldn't have been introduced to Anna Margolin, a 19th or early 20th century Yiddish language poet who was known for being a bold, radical, rebellious spirit. And this book is written in her memory, also in the memory of my father, Abraham Stephen Richter, who passed away 3 years ago. So I'm going to read a short excerpt from my collection, Nautilus and Bone. This is a short excerpt from a prose poem called So Uncommonly Bright for a Girl. I think of it as portrait of the artist as a young woman. There was once a village called Helm, inhabited solely by fools. There was an unlucky tailor and his poor wife who could have no children. 3 brothers came across a cottage in the wood. The world works in this way. There are fools and there are wise men. There are wise women too, but they are witches like Baba Ha and rarely beautiful. You can be clever, but also unkind. I fold the night sky's satin bundle into my lap, careful not to let the stars scatter over the floor. If there were no words, I would fashion them out of clay, maybe a little soil and water, some wet leaves and boiled sap to hold them together in sentences. Do you want to go further, my new stories ask? Shall we unveil ourselves, inquire the poems. In response, I take their cloven hooves in my conspicuously human fists. My pen hands me the crescent moon, a slice of sugared lemon to suck. It says, light this candle. Listen. And I'd just like to close with a quote from the Jewish poet, the late great Adrian Rich. It has always been true that poetry can break isolation, show us to ourselves when we are outlawed or made invisible, remind us of beauty where no beauty seems possible, remind us of kinship where all is represented as separation. Thank you so much once again for this amazing honor. I'm thrilled.
Hello, my name is Miriam Borden, and it is my pleasure to present Menachem Kaiser with the award in the category of biography for his book, Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure. I met Menachem actually at a party in Poland while he was writing this book. And though we didn't actually talk very much about it at the time, I could tell he was in the middle of a very challenging project. And I think I was right. The book tells the story of Menachem's quest to reclaim a residential building his family owned in Poland before the Second World War. But at its core, this book is not a book about pre-war Jewish property. It's about truth and history and how in a place like Poland, these do not always align. As a result of this tension between truth and history, in the independent Poland of the 21st century, the past remains raw and unreconciled, and the truth remains up for grabs. Whether hidden treasure is buried somewhere beneath Polish ground, whether one can prove that their family owned an apartment building before the war, indeed, whether one can prove that those family members are even dead, all of these are open to interpretation. It's a wild, absurd, and deeply resonant account of what it is to experience Poland today, to approach it with one set of questions and to leave it with an entirely different set of answers, and to let its history wash over you in its unsettling, uncanny way. So Mazel Tov Menachem on a beautiful and what I think is a very important book.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and to all the other organizers. It's really very special for me to win the Canadian Jewish Literary Award because it's a homecoming of sorts. I've been working on this book for a very long time, and sort of the story behind the story is that I went to Eastern Europe. I first went to Lithuania on a Fulbright, and without any sort of sense of my own family history. And then I went to Poland for kind of a bunch of strange and absurd series of events, and then I sort of ended up here. And the book is like a long and kind of zany adventure and has treasure hunters and apartment buildings, all these things. But ultimately, it is a kind of love letter to my own family and to where I come from. So I wanted to actually, am I able to share screen? Yes, I am. And so I wanted, one of the real treats that I had was being able to find old family videos that I was able to digitize. And so usually when I give book talks and I show media, I show kind of the sexy stuff, pictures of, the underground Nazi tunnels or the treasure hunters or sometimes the apartment building. But ultimately, it really is about, a family that I didn't get to know, and, most, especially my grandfather, but that I forged a relationship of a sort with him through this book. And we had a bunch of old Super 8s in the basement that I digitized, and I'd like to play that while I read the relevant section in the book. So yes, in a wide sense, the videos were predictable, but of course, in a more personal sense, they were anything but. I sat and watched, and I was heart-walloped. It was engrossing, eerie, sad, sentimental. It was a time capsule. It was time travel. I suppose seeing unfamiliar versions of familiar people will have this effect. When I say unfamiliar, I don't just mean younger. Here was Bubby, but a lovely, vibrant, carefree version of Bubby. A version of Bubby that seemed impossible. A version that seemed so much further away from the war than the Bubby I'd known, even though in a literal, chronological sense, the opposite was true. Here were my father and uncle, trusting and goofy and silly and teasing. My father was a pudgy kid and a striking young man. My uncle Herschel was beautiful and slim till well into adulthood. My mother, gorgeous and shy. And of course, my grandfather. Here he was. There he is. He cuts a striking figure, slim, dapper, almost always in suit, tie, fedora, freshly shaved. He looks like he smells good. How he moves, how he walks, hugs, smiles, stands, holds his children. He has an easy grace, something none of his children or grandchildren have inherited, and a charisma my father and others have referenced, but which I never really understood until I saw it. What did I see? I saw his liveliness, his joy, his spirit, his seriousness. This wasn't a new version of my grandfather. I had never known another. The image on these tapes wasn't working against the stored image. This man was entirely unfamiliar to me. And as I watched, I realized how unimagined, how empty his person as imagined by me, had been. Family sans familiarity is still family, but is at the same time something very different. I'd seen photographs of my grandfather. I recognized him, of course, nonetheless. A photograph captures essence, maybe sometimes, if you're lucky, but in movement, even or especially in silent movement, there's something so signature, personal, palpable, charisma and grace and spirits, and the rest of the words I'm using to describe my grandfather are, I submit, inherently dynamic attributes. They can be expressed only when there's resistance, when there's movement through or against the world. And so just wanted to thank everyone for the award. It's really a huge honor. And I particularly want to thank my parents who are watching today for all their support. And so, yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Menachem. And it's my privilege to present the 2021 Canadian Jewish Literary Award in the Holocaust category to The Light of Days, the untold story of women resistance fighters in Hitler's ghettos by Judy Batalion. With her book, Judy Batalion tells us about Renia Kukelka, Zivia Lubetkin, Frumka Plotnica, Tosia Altman, and other names we should never forget. She relates in detail the heroism and extraordinary accomplishments of these brave young Jewish women who became resistance fighters at the risk of their lives. The book points out the sad lack of recognition and even the misrepresentation of women's roles in the resistance. These young women some in their teens, acted with courage and guile and nerves of steel in the struggle against the Nazis. Judy Batalion introduces us to weapons strugglers, couriers, armed fighters, intelligence agents, and saboteurs who faced death and worse to carry out their missions. Women could do things men couldn't do. As Judy Batalion points out in The Light of Days, women couldn't be uncovered by the pants drop test. Judy Batalion grew up in Montreal as a child of survivors, as I did. In White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between, she's written about how the Holocaust affected her and how it affected the next generation. She went to the Volksschule, the Jewish People's School, which I went to as well. In grade 5, at the Volksschule, she learned about Hannah Shenesh, but not about the other women of resistance. And it said about a lifetime curiosity that she fulfilled with this book. Survivors don't often talk about what they went through. They were witnesses to the brutal murder of their families and neighbors, violent destruction and atrocities. It was intense and stirs up memories you would rather not have. Judy Batalion tells the stories of these women with respect and accuracy. She says, inspired by the women's fighters' memoirs, I began to see the importance of laying out stories that were multifaceted. History needs to account for complexities. Otherwise, no one will believe the storyteller. The meticulous research she conducted over 12 years shows how important it was to Judy Batalion to tell these stories. Judy Batalion draws on interviews, diaries, and other sources, often in Yiddish, to deliver a vigorous narrative much in need of telling. The Light of Days is nonfiction, but it reads like a thriller. Sometimes you wish the stories she tells were fiction. Judy Batalion.
Hello.
Hi, Judy.
Hi. All right. Can you see me? Great. Sorry. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm already verklempt. 14 years ago, I was living in London and I was thinking a lot about my Jewish identity. I'm, as you said, the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I was thinking a lot about what I call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma trickles down between generations. I'm a very anxious person. And at that time in my life, everything felt particularly dangerous to me. And I began to wonder if my Holocaust heritage was shaping how I perceived and how I reacted to everyday threats. I decided to write about this. I was actually doing a lot of comedy at the time, and I decided to write a performance piece about strong Jewish women who confronted danger. And as you said, the first to come to mind was someone who I studied in grade 5 at JPPS, Hannah Senes, the young Hungarian poet who'd made Aliyah in the 1930s, but during World War II decided to fight back. She joined the Allied forces, became a paratrooper, and volunteered to return to Nazi-occupied Europe. She was caught very early on, but legend has it she looked her executioners in the eye as they shot her. I grew up with Hannah Senes as a symbol of Jewish courage. But back in 2007, I didn't really want to read about Hannah Senes, the hero. I wanted to understand the person. Who does that? Who chooses to go fight the Nazis? What motivates that audacity? What prompts such courage and conviction? Seeking a more nuanced psychological portrait, I went to the British Library. I looked up Hannah Senes in the catalog, and I ordered the few books listed under her name. I went to pick up my stack, and I noticed that one of the books was a bit unusual. It was old with yellowing pages and a blue fabric cover with gold embossed writing, and it was in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But even more unusual than the book is the fact that I speak Yiddish. But I can't find her. She's only in the last 10 pages. In front of her, 150 pages with dozens and dozens of other young Jewish women who defied the Nazis, and mainly from the ghettos in Poland. Guns, grenades, espionage. I'd never heard anything like this. The ghetto girls hid revolvers and teddy bears, built elaborate underground bunkers, flirted with Nazis, bought them off with wine and whiskey, and shot them. They planned uprisings, they carried out intelligence missions, and they were the bearers of the truth about what was happening to the Jews. They slipped in and out of ghettos, bringing Jews information and hope, bulletins and false Aryan papers, as well as pistols, bullets, and explosives. They helped the sick, they clothed the children, they organized soup kitchens, underground schools, and printing presses. They flung Molotov cocktails in ghetto uprisings and blew up Nazi supply trains. Frumka Plotnicka, Tosha Altman, Gusta Davidson, Rushka Korzak, Masha Futermilk, Livia Lubekin. Over 12 years of research, I found out about hundreds of them. These young Jews saw the truth of their time, worked together, and risked their lives in the fight for justice and liberty. Their small acts mattered to them, to the people around them, and I think to us now, generations later. Small victories are achievable and necessary for great change. It is through these young women that I learned that not only is trauma passed along generations, but so is courage and daring, passion and compassion. I am humbled to have unveiled this hidden heritage of Jewish female bravado, and profoundly honored to receive the Canadian Jewish Literary Award, which I do on behalf of our foremothers, these freedom fighters. May their memory be a blessing and an inspiration. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Pierre Anctil, and I'm introducing today the Scholarship Award for a book entitled Survivors, Children's Lives After the Holocaust, written by Rebecca Clifford, who's a history professor at Durham University in the UK. It is an exceptionally rich and systematic exploration of the life trajectories of 100 children who were 10 years old or younger at the time of their liberation in 1945. Through archives found in 12 countries, including Canada, and through personal interviews, the author follows in detail the deep impact the events of the Holocaust had on their lives and on those who educated them. The narratives extend into the adulthood of these children, and even to old age. These stories of trauma, disorientation, and survival mirror the work of other scholars, such as Anna Freud, who produced earlier descriptions of complex post-Shoah personal situations. Félicitations. Congratulations, Rebecca.
Pierre, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and I want to really give my thanks to everybody involved in the award. I know what an enormous amount of work it is to read all these books, to have the meetings, to take the time to do this, and I'm enormously grateful. I want to start by reading you a little excerpt from the introduction to the book. So in the summer of 1946, 7-year-old Litzy S., a survivor of Theresienstadt ghetto camp who had been brought to England after her liberation, was approached by a man in the care home where she was living with other child survivors of the Holocaust. The man explained that he was her father and that the woman he was with was her mother. This seemed at the time plausible enough. Neither children nor staff in the care home, tucked away in a tranquil country village in Surrey, had a clear picture of what had happened to the children's parents. So Litzy went home with the family who had come to claim her and had what was, at least on the surface, a normal childhood from that point forwards. Her life before she was reunited with her family became part of a dimly remembered past. She was sometimes troubled by memories that she could make no sense of, memories of rough wooden bunk beds and large rooms filled with other children. But her parents brushed off her questions, and after a while she stopped asking. At the age of 18, in the midst of a family row, she screamed in anger at the man who had come to claim her 11 years before. "I wish you weren't my father." "I'm not," replied the man. He was in fact her father's brother, and like many others who cared for child survivors after the war, he had judged it better to lie about the murder of Litzy's parents than to take the precarious route forwards offered by the truth. I wanted to read this to you because I wanted to explain that I see this as a book fundamentally about how you can make sense of your life if you don't know where you come from, and how you can start to piece together fragmentary childhood memories when you lack that thing, that vehicle that allows us to make sense of our childhood memories, which is the social fabric of memory, the family and communities around us that allow us to take these scraps that all children have and put them together into a coherent narrative. I really have to say that one of the things I hoped would be true when I wrote the book, and I hope it is for everybody who reads it, is that you could pick up the book, and even if you don't have a family connection to the Holocaust, even if you're not Jewish, it shouldn't matter. You can see something about your own journey to make sense of your childhood memories in the book, and that's very much was one of my goals. I have to add that it's just hugely meaningful to me as a Canadian who's lived abroad for nearly 20 years in the UK, to receive a Canadian honor, and such an important Canadian honor. And as Pierre said, there is a very strong Canadian element in the book. I was hugely privileged to be able to access the case records of children who came to Canada, child Holocaust survivors, on a scheme run by the Canadian Jewish Congress between 1947 and 1952. It's very, very difficult to access case records from that period of the late 1940s and early 1950s, often because of privacy reasons. So virtually all the European records are closed. So to be able to see these Canadian ones meant that I could build up the stories of child Holocaust survivors who settled in Canada. So you'll find they're very present in the book. And so it's also in that way very meaningful to receive this award. And I also was thinking now about something Gary said earlier. This is a book about living with and living after childhood experiences of trauma and of genocide. And I think that these issues are very pertinent, very raw right now in Canada when we think about the history of treatment of Indigenous people, Indigenous children. And in that sense, although of course it's a very different set of children in the book, I think that readers will find that the themes are very topical to our Canadian moment. So I really just want to say thank you again, and also just extend an enormous thanks to my whole extended family. I can see, glancing at the list of participants, that many of you are here. My family was hugely supportive in helping me in every way through the writing of a book that took 6 years to write. So thank you again, and back to you.
Thank you all. And those, ladies and gentlemen, are the Canadian Jewish Literary Award honorees for 2021. Our Q&A function is open if you want to ask them any questions for an enhanced conversation. And I'd like to ask the first one. I would like to note that of our 6 winners this year, 5 of our books are informed by the Holocaust. And you talked about it, and I just want to hear a little bit more about why the Holocaust is such an important part of Jewish literature, and how can we keep on telling the stories now that there are very, very few survivors left, and there will be less as years go by. Who wants to take that first?
I might talk about that. I think following up on what a number of other people have mentioned, it's also being like the grant, being at this generation is what is our role now, this many generations after, to maintain that memory, to understand what it means, to also understand it in relationship to other genocides that we know about. And so what does it mean about humans? What does it mean going forward? What does it mean in our current moment? Sometimes these stories of the Holocaust are often challenged, and so to hold fast with remembering, but also then to take our understanding of the Holocaust as the paradigmatic genocide, and to use that as a tool for compassion and understanding, I think. And I also think that we have learned, for me anyway, I was thinking about like intergenerational trauma, definitely, and so now we understand that in relationship to Indigenous people. So now we have these connections, and maybe we can understand the Jewish experience through some of our understanding of other genocides, and also, of course, bringing it back the other way, I think. So I think it really is, unfortunately, it is always something that remains relevant for Jews and for humans.
I know I've written several books about the Holocaust. And when I speak to children, when I go into schools and speak to children, one of the things I say to them is that it's important to learn how hate can spread, and that the lesson I want them to take away from it is that they can't, prevent a war or solve a war across the world, but they can certainly prevent one in their schoolyard, in their classroom, that they should stand up against bullies, that if they see any kind of hate, they're the ones who need to stop that little spark before it becomes a fire. And that's the message I use when I talk to young people about the Holocaust. It may be history, but it's the lesson for you today in your own lives. What can happen if hate gets out of hand? Anyone else?
Further comments?
I wonder, I have a question of Gary, and it has to do with how he used humor to give to give a greater resonance to the stories that he tells about the Holocaust, which in and of themselves are clearly not funny, but he uses humor as a way of, in a sense, providing a lens for all of us who have heard and read and understood Holocaust stories for so many years, a lens through which we can see some of this horror in a different way. And I'd just like you to comment a little bit about that use of humor, please, Gary.
Sure, thank you. I always think of humor as one of the great human technologies, as a way of, it does a number of things. It reframes stories. It gives agency to the person who is able to make humor, or it looks at things from the other perspective. It also I think it also builds community between, if you're imagining to finding something funny or darkly, grimly, ironically, some dark comedy, you're imagining, I think you're kind of telling a joke with somebody else. You're imagining community. I also think, specifically in the Jewish context, I mean, it's a common rabbinic Talmudic thing to do, is to start with a joke, to unpack, to pull the rug under assumptions, so things don't calcify, so you can open them up to investigation. And of course, it also just helps you make it through somehow. You have the most grim situations that you're encountering, and somehow to be able to share a joke or imagine something darkly humorous about it, it creates some kind of sustenance, I think, and which is not to say that you don't go home at night and weep and are overwhelmed, but there are those moments of humor that helps you, I think, that helps you make it through. Like the quote from Avram Sutzkever, he's talking about crossing the minefield. Well, of course, it's a horrific, traumatic thing, but somehow he has this funny irony about, like, it's this marvelous, dark, strange joke that we're alive at all, and that we possibly could continue to be alive. Like, that's, to me, the most profoundly, darkly humorous marvel of it all. So to incorporate that in writing, make it just seem very natural to me.
Thank you.
I was also thinking about other people's use. I think that, like, Lisa, your work incorporates humor, or kind of the irony. Even the piece you read about, well, if women are old and they're witches, and there's something that helps you through those texts because of, it helps you unpack history by that kind of humor that you use. It's a different kind of, it's much less broad humor than I'm using, but it's certainly there.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, for me, humor is a subversive tactic, and it's a way of undermining any attempt at pretense, and it's a way of undermining and subverting the status quo. And that's what I'm all about. And I think that's one of the things that drew me to the figure of Anna Margolin, who was always standing up and speaking truth to power, and taking down the patriarchy. So for me, there's also a quote from Emma Goldman as an epigraph to one of my poems, like, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of this revolution, paraphrasing probably badly. But humor is integral to the process of smashing patriarchy and smashing all the systems of oppression. So I think that's how it ended up in my book.
Question that I had for you, Judy, was, you told so many stories in your book. How many more are there? There are so many women of resistance that stories need to be told. Is there another book in the works? How can we tell all those stories?
Thank you for asking that. When I started this project, I started it by accident by finding that Yiddish book, which listed probably about 50 women who were involved in the underground. And over the years, as I researched them and read their testimonies, and I started making lists of all the names I came across, and I found hundreds of women that were Jewish women involved in the organized underground in Poland. And I actually think it's in the realm of thousands. My book came out 6 months ago. I still every day get emails from people. Did you read a story about a woman in Warsaw on a bus who was that's my grandmother, or someone else, my mother was giving messages to Hannah Senish. I met a woman every day, survivors, people who knew survivors, families of survivors, and those who didn't survive are in touch with me telling more stories. So I don't have a number, but I think there are thousands and thousands of women who were involved in a particular organized underground in Poland. And I just wanted to say one thing about humor, because I can't resist, is that there was humor in the Holocaust. It's not just that we are talking about our history through a humorous lens as a way for us to perhaps help our trauma, our legacy of trauma. But when I look through these books, these primary source material, I read through testimonies and memoirs, and there are jokes in them. They are funny at times. There was a Broadway in the Warsaw Ghetto. There were, they had this a very famous, Hitler went to a psychic. He said, she said, "You're going to die on a Jewish holiday." He said, "Oh no, what holiday?" He said, "Any day you die will be a Jewish holiday." And that was a Warsaw Ghetto stand-up joke. Humor was used by women in particular. Actually, I had to cut a chapter about it because it was too long. But women, it's a way of solidarity. Self-deprecating humor is a way of, taking control of a situation in which you have no control. And these women made so many jokes about how they looked, their heads being shaved, the clothes they were wearing. They often wrote about it with humor as well.
Many of you wrote your books over a number of years. You've been thinking about it a long time. Is that the hardest aspect of writing a book? This really is out of a question that Anne Dublin, the great Canadian children's writer, has asked me, which was the hardest aspect of writing your book. Is that what it is? Is it getting that inspiration and living with that inspiration for your life? What's the hard? You took 12 years, Judy. Rebecca, you spent years and years researching it. What's the hardest aspect?
Well, I can speak a little bit too. Actually, I felt like I had something to follow on from what both Gary and Judy and Lisa said about humor, which is apropos to this as well. I was trying to think if there's any humor in the book. I don't know if I would call it humor. There's a lot of pleasure in the book for me as the author, hopefully for the readers as well. I know that sounds strange. So many people said to me over the 6 years I worked on the book, "Oh, you're working on a book on children who survived the Holocaust. That's so depressing. How do you deal with the heaviness of that?" And I always felt kind of embarrassing. I don't find it depressing to work on this. I love working on this. In fact, 6 years wasn't enough, frankly. I could have kept going. And I think that's because there's a beauty and pleasure in ordinary life. And that's what comes across in the lives of these 100 child survivors in this book. They do survive, and they go on, most of them, to have really very ordinary lives. And there's an incredible victory in the ordinariness, and there's loads of pleasure in the ordinariness. And I close the book actually by talking. I also learned an awful lot from the people I interviewed for this book. And there was one woman, she really shocked me. I guess it shouldn't have shocked me, but I was in Washington, D.C. We were having an interview. It's in 2015. And she told me, and I talk about this in the book, she told me the story of having been trapped in a ghetto with her family during the war, having terrifying experiences that stayed with her for a very long time. And, we talked about this. And then at some point, I think maybe I turned off my tape recorder. We were having lunch together. And she said, but, that was not the worst part of my life. The worst part of my life was when my husband died. And I shouldn't have been shocked by that, but I was. I think we're so used to thinking in this really quite actually, sort of blind way about Holocaust survivors, as if the Holocaust must necessarily have been the most horrible thing that ever happened to them. And it was sort of like a slow march back towards something else, through the rest of their life. But she told me very honestly, actually, the worst part of my life was this totally pedestrian moment that most people will live through at some point, right? The loss of a spouse. And it was so, so moving in its, I don't want to say banality, it's not banal, but in its ordinariness. It happens to so many people. Everybody can relate to that. And for me, that was the pleasure in writing this. It wasn't a constant 6-year-long struggle with trauma. Okay, that was there. But actually, it was a 6-year-long embrace of beautiful, lifelong stories.
I don't want to leave you out of this discussion, Sigal, because you didn't write about the Holocaust, but you wrote about another aspect of Jewish history, and Jewish history which related to your background, which is Sephardic. And how do you relate to this kind of having to go back to your history and being able to find your roots in what you're writing?
Thanks for asking that. Yeah, I think in some ways, I think this is a kind of survivorship, but a different kind. I think Judaism, Jewish culture, what it means to be Jewish is, of course, so much more than just this one, traumatic experience or all the traumas the Jewish people have experienced, right? There is like such a rich and varied and diverse history. And I'm interested in recuperating many more aspects of that and many more ways that it looked and can going forward look to be Jewish. I think one thing that was like really stunning to me about Osnat is that she was completely a pioneer and a brilliant polymath, like just incredible trailblazer. And nobody I know, including my friends who are female rabbis and Orthodox female rabbis too, nobody knows about her. That's just crazy to me. I think like I'm really grateful to scholars who resurrect from, the few extant historical records we have, who resurrect stories like this, because I think they are helping the legacy of people like Osnat Barzani survive in our memories, and through that, like a vision of what else Judaism has looked like and can again look like is being allowed to survive. So I'm really interested in telling those kinds of stories, which I think it's really helpful to have more of those, particularly for people like me growing up in the Sephardi and Mizrahi world, where we typically do not see ourselves represented in literature. So I think it's like especially good for kids growing up in those communities to have books where they do see themselves represented. And I hope this book will be one of them.
Sigal, it's Rita here. And I'm actually quite intrigued by the picture I see on the wall above your left shoulder there. I guess, is that family with a patriarch?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm glad you asked that. Thank you. This is actually a really old photograph of my Baghdadi family. This is my relatives who moved in the 1800s from Baghdad to Bombay, which is where my grandmother was born and raised. And she's the one who gave me this amulet that I'm wearing today in her honor. And I remember when I first saw this photo a few years back, I really wanted to enlarge it and hang it up because when you see there, I don't know how clearly you can see, but the hat, the clothes, the mustaches, the like all of that, it's in our sort of North American Jewish context today, I think that is not what a lot of people picture when they're picturing what does Jewish look like. But that absolutely is what Jewish looked like. So I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Well, on my father's side, I'm Iraqi Jewish. And so it was really particularly interesting to me that was your background and how you came to, well, in a sense, how you came to be interested in your story, the beautiful story that you wrote. There's a lot I would love to unpack around that, but there's others who have questions and want to be heard from. I'd love to hear from some more of the writers. Thank you very much, Sigal.
Thank you.
As the jury, we got to read all of your books and a lot more. I'm just wondering, because you couldn't have read everything that all the other writers have written and what they talked about today, just how you're affected by their stories and how it informs what you've been writing and what you've been reading. I'm asking for your reaction to this event that we're having today.
I can start. I've been so moved by hearing these stories and hearing the journeys that other authors have gone through to bring their books to fruition, especially the stories of digging into historical research and records and archives, because that's not something I typically do as a poet. And that's not usually the starting place for me for a poem either. Usually it starts with a line or with an image or with a snippet of language. In the case of my book, it began with the name. Margolin was the name of my great-grandfather before it was changed to something that sounded less Jewish in order to avoid anti-Semitism. And even though Anna Margolin was a pseudonym, that was the initial connection point. But I've been so moved and inspired to hear these stories, and in particular, stories of resistance and stories and narratives of women who were unconventional and trailblazers, whether they were resistance fighters in the Polish ghetto or Mizrahi rabbis. I'm just blown away by all these common points, and by Gary's narrative as well, inspired by family stories and heritage. So I'm really just grateful to be in this space right now and to be witness to all these different kinds of stories.
I think I find this also very inspiring and moving. For me, I guess I don't hang around with other Jewish writers, especially other writers who are like maybe poets or fiction writers, but the whole range of engagement with some of these issues. So the idea of kind of looking through what is Jewish identity, what is history, all of these things, that is also very powerful. And the other thing to me is thinking about how what Jewishness is, the range of what that is. And in some of these stories, we, like so much in life, we tend to compact things into a limited notion of identities or into almost stereotypes. And really, of course, it's so broad. I mean, Judaism isn't just Ashkenazi Judaism. And even in those places, in my novel, I'm writing about what happened in Lithuania, but there are Karaite Jews. There's a whole variety of different people with different identities that were right there that tend to maybe get overlooked or not thought about. So I find this and other people's engagement with all the specific stories, all the I guess remarkable people and remarkable stories that are there and can continue to be unpacked. Whether women, resistance fighters, families. Parents, children, just all the situations. It sort of seems like a vast world that maybe it sometimes just gets boiled down to Fiddler on the Roof or something, and that's it. But it's of course much vast and much more complex, and that's really inspiring to be reminded of that. And Jews are really talkative, and they just are all talking all over each other all the time, even on Zoom. It's remarkable.
Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Can I ask one more? I'm sorry, I feel like I'm asking a lot. Menachem, I really enjoyed your book. Like many of the books on this list I had read or ordered before I was on the jury. And it reads a little bit like sort of like a detective thriller, but again, like with those questions that you get, you get a different set of answers to, so they can't put the questions and the answers together, and you don't actually come to a resolution of your quest for finding out, though you find out so much in the process, as you said. I'm just wondering whether you're continuing that quest and whether there might be another book where you will reveal all.
The legal efforts are continuing. I can't imagine writing another book about this. I was actually sort of, in contrast to some of the other panels, very reluctant to write a book about the Holocaust. I sort of promised myself a million times that I would never do it. And so actually, when the attempts to reclaim the building began, I said, I'm not going to write about it. It wasn't until I got involved with the treasure hunters that the story got so weird that I felt I had to at least try. So I feel a lot of resistance to writing about the Holocaust. I feel it's very difficult. There's it's very hard to avoid certain kinds of sentimentalities and cliches that frankly, really frightened me as a writer. But no, I don't see this being another book on this topic, unless something very, very bizarre happens, which it might. But yeah, I think that's sort of the end. I'm happy with an unresolved ending.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for writing your books and for talking to us today, because it was really interesting and informative. And I always get asked by people who know me, they say, wow, you have 6 books. Which one of the 6 should I read? And my answer today would be, read all 6 of them. They're all really outstanding books, and they're all worth reading, and they're different. And each book that you read is going to give you a different aspect of Jewish identity and what Jewish writing is. So I thank you all. I encourage everybody who's watching us today to go out and buy all the books. And you might want to read each other's books as well. I think you really enjoyed each other as well. And I want to tell you that the event today is going to be up on our YouTube page. So you could watch yourselves again, and everybody else could watch you. And I hope you all enjoyed today. And it was a real honor to meet you all and to be able to read your books. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.